By the time the mocking stopped, it was already too late for the men hidden in the trees. He lay motionless in mud and crushed leaves, cheek pressed to the stock of a rifle other men had laughed at only days earlier. They'd called it a mail-order gun, as if that settled everything, as if how it reached his hands mattered more than what he could do with it. Around him, the line had gone quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that meant everyone was waiting for the next shot from somewhere they still couldn't see. Before that moment, he was just another man in the line, another tired face in a unit, learning how fast confidence disappears when Japanese snipers own the daylight. The problem wasn't only that men were getting hit, it was the way they were getting hit. One step into a clearing, one head raised a second too long, one runner crossing ground that looked safe, and then a crack, a collapse, and nobody could point to where the shot came from. That was why the rifle mattered. It didn't look like what the others trusted. It looked personal, too deliberate, like something people imagine belongs in a case instead of jungle mud. Men who had watched equipment come and go took one glance and made the kind of judgments soldiers make when fear is close and humor is easier than admitting uncertainty. Mail order, civilian, a nice toy. He didn't argue. In places like that, proof beats speech. He prepared without drama. He checked the action and protected what needed protecting. The first day was mostly waiting, and waiting is where many people lose the battle before the shooting begins. Hours passed in heat, insects, and false signals. He held his breathing steady and watched a strip of brush above a narrow lane where men had been targeted earlier. Nothing. Then, not movement exactly, but a correction. Leaves lifted and settled against the wind instead of with it. He held his breathing steady and watched a strip of brush above a narrow lane where men had been targeted earlier. Nothing. Then, not movement exactly, but a correction. Leaves lifted and settled against the wind instead of with it. The result was immediate. The brush broke. A body rolled just enough to confirm what the line had been searching for. He didn't stay to absorb it. He scanned, found nothing he trusted, and moved anyway, low and fast, to the next position he had already chosen in his head. Minutes later, shots tore into the place he'd just left. They had marked his muzzle flash and answered. Their answer missed, because he treated the first shot as the beginning of the problem, not the end. That became the rhythm. Observe, detect, confirm, fire, scan, move. By the second day, the field was already changing. The Japanese snipers grew more disciplined, fewer openings, longer delays, better use of shadow. He noticed the sound of a shot was becoming less useful. So he stopped trusting sound alone and started reading what happened after it. Where leaves trembled from recoil, where a branch quivered after contact, where a patch of brush stayed too rigid while everything around it breathed. That adjustment produced another result, and then another. Each one eased the line's breathing for a while, and each one made the work harder. They started using silence as bait. They changed elevation, taking angles from slightly higher ground where most men scanned straight ahead. He caught one because bark, above eye level, looked freshly scraped. He caught another because a low route that seemed abandoned was too clean to trust. He fired, moved, waited, and passed on shots he couldn't confirm. By the third day, strain began to show. Midday brought one of the closest calls. He'd taken a position overlooking broken ground where roots, stumps, and low brush created 100 hiding places. He spotted a likely firing point only after noticing what was missing. In a small pocket of sunlight, there was no drift of insects, no lazy shimmer of air, as if something had disturbed the space and then held still. He eased into aim. Before he committed, another shot cracked from a different angle and clipped the space he'd been studying. He dropped lower. He watched for the second man. Then, off to the side and slightly behind it, a shape shifted to check the effect of the first shot. He took that one first. When the second man reacted and tried to relocate, the movement exposed him. 2 shots, 2 decisions, both made under the pressure of knowing the trap had almost worked. After that, the answers came faster. Return fire reached his old positions as if their communication had tightened. Routes that had once been safe became risky because they began anticipating where a patient shooter would relocate. So he changed his pattern again, sometimes moving shorter than expected, sometimes farther, sometimes holding longer than his instincts wanted, letting the enemy commit to the wrong expectation. By then, nobody said mail order with a grin. The fourth day opened with a different kind of silence, the kind that can mean either the problem is ending or the problem is about to tighten. Men still moved carefully, but there was less paralysis now. Messages crossed ground that had been feared. A runner made a trip and came back. But the count was not complete, and he knew better than to mistake momentum for safety. The final engagements came under compounded pressure: fatigue, heat, memory of near misses, enemy adaptation, and the simple fact that success turns a shooter into a priority target. He took a position that was good for observation and bad for comfort, then stayed there longer than he wanted, because the field ahead looked wrong in a familiar way. Too still in one place and too active in another, a pattern trying to look natural. He waited until the pattern betrayed itself. A muzzle showed first, brief, then gone. Not enough, he held. Minutes later, a shoulder line appeared where foliage thinned during a shift. He committed, fired, and moved only far enough to avoid the immediate reply, because he sensed another shooter watching the same lane. The reply came hard into his old angle. Then, as expected, a second observer exposed part of himself to assess what had happened. The follow-up from the new position dropped him. The last one took the longest. Late in the day, he caught one. Leaves settling in sequence, not by wind, but by weight, shifting inch by inch. He tracked the disturbance to where it ended, trusted the inference, and fired through concealment he wouldn't have trusted earlier in the week. 11 in 4 days. On a page, numbers can look too clean. In the field, every one of those shots had a chain behind it. Someone who could cross ground more safely. Someone who could move a message, carry supplies, pull a wounded man back, or simply stand up without feeling watched by an invisible rifle. The count mattered because of what it released. The pressure eased. The line began to move like a line again, instead of a row of men waiting to be punished for moving. Back from the fight, the change in tone was immediate and almost awkward. Men who had mocked the rifle looked at it differently. And some looked at him differently too, trying to reconcile the jokes with the results. Command wanted details. Where were the firing points? What signs had he trusted? How often did he move? The questions themselves were recognition. The conversation was no longer about whether the rifle belonged there. It was about what had just been learned. And that is how a private argument about gear becomes something larger. What happened next was not a miracle and not a single feat that rewrote the war. Real change moves slower than legends. But it does move. A mocked method works under pressure. People pay attention, and hard lessons from one stretch of ground get carried outward. Patience becomes teachable. The conversation was no longer about whether the rifle belonged there. It was about what had just been learned. And that is how a private argument about gear becomes something larger. What happened next was not a miracle and not a single feat that rewrote the war. Real change moves slower than legends. But it does move. A mocked method works under pressure. People pay attention, and hard lessons from one stretch of ground get carried outward. Patience becomes teachable. Position discipline becomes a standard. The idea that hidden shooters can be hunted, not merely endured, starts to spread. The rifle returned in those conversations as more than metal and wood. It became shorthand for judgment under ridicule, for choosing what fit the problem instead of what looked respectable to everyone else. Not because the tool alone won the duel. It didn't. The tool mattered, but only in the hands of someone willing to wait, read, adapt, and move after every shot. Precision was a mindset before it was a trigger press. Later, when the story was retold away from mud and fear, people naturally reached for the headline first: the mail-order rifle, the mockery, the 11 hidden shooters in 4 days. Those details deserve to survive. But the heart of the story is smaller and harder to dramatize. It is a man refusing to let other people's confidence decide his method. It is discipline under boredom. It is restraint when a worse shooter would rush. It is the repeated choice to treat each success as the start of the next danger, not the end of the last one. That is why the story lasts. Not because it flatters war. If anything, it shows how ugly and intimate war becomes when lives turn on tiny signs in leaves and shadow. Not because it promises that one skilled person can solve every battlefield problem. He couldn't. No one can. It lasts because for 4 days in one violent corner of a much larger conflict, a man turned ridicule into proof and gave the men around him something they had been losing: room to move, room to think, and the belief that an unseen enemy could be seen, studied, and beaten. And once a unit believes that, the jungle stops being only a place where the enemy hides and starts being a place where the enemy can be found.